because the stronger you put up front on pre-auth, the more false positives you have. I really feel like it's going backwards in that way, that we're going to have to put more focus
Yeah.
on anti-fraud across the board, not
Mhm.
just kind of the stopgap or band-aid that alerts use.
Hey everybody, James Shepard here with another edition of the Merchant Sales Podcast. Today I'm interviewing for the second time a guy named Scott Adams, really one of the foremost experts on dealing with chargebacks, but more specifically dealing with VAMP, which is Visa's new way of handling these things. This is a must-listen episode if you have anything to do with merchant sales or compliance or underwriting or any of that. You're going to want to listen to this because, again, he just is very well connected with the card brands and understands these things in a really unique way. Then Rich Norton gives us some sales tips from the field, and then we follow that up with Patti Murphy giving us 4 relevant stories, very interesting things happening right now in the world of payments. We talk about stablecoin, we talk about some Fed payments, and other things like that that are just very interesting happenings at this time. This episode is brought to you by Nativia. You can head over to nativia.com/ccsalespro to learn more about what Nativia has to offer. A fantastic payment processing company, access to capital for ISOs, just a bunch of really cool things that they have going on right now. We interviewed Vlad, I believe it was last week. So you can check out that episode if you want to learn more about what they do. I also always like to mention that neither Scott Adams or his company, they're not sponsors or consulting clients or anything like that of mine. Just a great episode with an industry expert. With that being said, let's dive into this episode. Hey everybody, I'm here with Scott Adams, the CEO at Fraud Deflect. How you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing awesome. So it's been a couple years since we had you on the podcast. Had you on right at the beginning of launching Fraud Deflect. Obviously, a lot has changed. Today, we're really going to focus on VAMP because this is a hot topic right now. But before we do that, for those that haven't, didn't listen to the first one, tell us who you are and what you do, Scott. I'd really appreciate that.
Sure. So like James said, I'm Scott Adams, CEO, co-founder of Fraud Deflect. Been doing fraud payments risk for 25 something years now. And, my co-founder also has been doing this for like 15 years. So, at Fraud Deflect, we bring a ton of experience. Most of our team has been merchants in the past, so we know the pains and how things work out there. And at Fraud Deflect, we have a platform that allows merchants to really protect themselves from chargebacks. We focus on deflection, not alerts, but obviously we sell alerts too. Most of our merchants go from much higher than thresholds of, 2, 3, 4% down to 0.2, 0.3 in less than a month. So we're really looking to change how this whole industry works and be a trusted entity, which, there's so few out there now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm excited to circle back to that actually at the end. I want to talk more about specifically how you do that. But before we dive into all that, talk about VAMP. First of all, what do these letters stand for? What is the program? Give us a high level, if you would, to start with.
Sure. So, if going back a ways, a lot of people know about Visa's, they called at the time the VMPI, the Visa Merchant Purchase Inquiry, which is now Verify Order Insight. And then they brought out around the time we started this company, actually, Compelling Evidence 3, which is kind of the next step and another way to prevent chargebacks without having to do refunds. But really what all these systems are things to prevent you from going on what used to be called the Visa Dispute Monitoring Program, or if you're a little bit older, the Visa Chargeback Monitoring Program, and then now also the Visa Fraud Monitoring Program. But it's always been confusing because there's all these different acronyms and programs. Right. So now there's VAMP, which would have been not confusing, except they keep changing the rules. And so, so this new thing, which did go into effect technically in April, but it's on kind of a trial period till October, it's VAMP, it's Visa Acquirer Monitoring Program, which is confusing because you think, okay, it doesn't apply to me, I'm a merchant. But it actually does. They basically combined everything. They've taken the VDMP, the VFMP, and the acquirer monitoring programs, lumped them all together. And this one regulation basically brings together those programs and specifies thresholds and rules for each party. So really, you can think of it as really the new number you need to watch on the Visa side is your VAMP rate.
And so backing up a little bit here, Scott, and zooming out a little bit more. So we have a chargeback. All right. So let's go back to this, right? So I go online, I make a purchase for $1,000, and I then claim that I did not agree to this purchase. Walk me through what does that look like? What does the consumer do? And then what's happening behind the scenes with a program like VAMP to potentially keep this from occurring if it's friendly fraud?
Sure. Well, so, VAMP doesn't prevent it at all. VAMP gives us a rate to monitor of how often this happens. So kind of starting there, right? So go back to the consumer. So the
Yeah,
consumer, as you said, doesn't recognize the transaction. It's fraud. It's mistaken identity. Who knows? But the consumer says, I didn't do it,
right,
right? So ideally, they'd call us, the merchants, but they don't. They instead call Citibank or their issuer.
right.
When that happens, the issuer picks up the phone, and the consumer says, "Hey, I didn't do it." In the old days, or if you're not using any programs to prevent this, this is the problem right there. The issuer knows nothing. They know your card number, they know the cardholder's name,
Hmm.
they know the merchant as per their DBA registration, and they know the dollar amount and the date. They know nothing else. So then they say, okay, consumer, well, you must be right. It's fraud. And then this becomes a chargeback. So as far as the consumer is concerned, they just got their refund. They're happy.
Right,
They don't know all this merchant stuff that we know.
right.
Right. And so that's the whole consumer experience. They're happy, it's over, unless you represent. But with these systems out there, right? So with VAMP, you can only have so many of those chargebacks. But here's all the other catch. VAMP adds in the TC40s, which is a little bit different, right? So we just talked about a chargeback. But what if, let's say that it's a $5 charge, and the issuer says, you know what? Let me weigh the costs here. If I do a chargeback, the merchant might represent, and that's going to take me a bunch of time and man hours to fight.
Hmm.
So most issuers will weigh this and say, you know what? I'm not doing a chargeback. I'm just going to give the consumer their money back. They'll pay us back in multiples with interest. So they don't hit the chargeback button, but they're supposed to hit another button that marks it as a fraudulent transaction to tell Visa and inform Visa's AI machine learning. That's a
Hmm.
TC40. So what VAMP's doing
Interesting.
is that's actually taking the chargeback plus the TC40 and dividing it by the settled transactions. And so
Kind of
that's
looking,
the
they're
new
looking at that
the new world we're
percentage.
living in.
And give us some concept here of like, okay, if I'm a merchant and I'm doing, 1,000 transactions a month or whatever, what percentage does it start to become where, hey, I'm getting on the radar of Visa in a negative way?
So here's again, I said this is a confusing situation. There's a lot of confusion on this, and I'm honestly not sure we'll really know until probably beginning of next year. But here's what the rules say. The new rule of VAMP says, as a merchant, you're in trouble at 2.2% up through I believe it's January. And then in January, that drops to 1.5%. But they're not really enforcing this until October. So, and I could see
Got
them
it.
pushing that out a bit. And I could be wrong there. It might be April when they move it to 1.5. Actually, I think it is. So I
Mm,
think it's 2.2 now. It's 1.5 in April.
wow.
So it's a higher percentage, but depending on the merchant, so especially like a subscription merchant or a merchant that's got a really low ticket, that TC40 number, which most people don't ever monitor or even know about,
Mm,
could be multiples of your chargeback number. So
interesting.
major problem here for merchants.
Interesting. Yeah, I actually had never even heard of that. And I've been in the payments industry a long time. So I've never heard of that. And so to clarify what this is, we're saying that when a consumer, if a consumer calls the bank and the bank says, wow, this is a pretty small amount. We don't really want to go through all the hassle of dealing with a chargeback and representment from the merchant. So we'll just say, okay, fine, we'll just give you this money. You're saying that rather than trying to figure out if it was a legitimate transaction or not, they're just going to refund the money to them. Are you saying that the banks are typically not marking it correctly, or they are marking it correctly, and Visa considers that to be a fraudulent transaction? Or
Yeah, it's not incorrect. It's really a business decision for the bank. In a way, up until now. And still it's just a business decision, right? For the
Mhm.
issuing bank, Visa says you're supposed to mark it as fraud if it's fraud. And if you want to give the money back and take it from the merchant, you hit chargeback. So that's
Mm,
that's the situation, is that you basically have these two buttons, and maybe they're combined. I don't know the issuer's actual system, but you basically have these two check boxes. And the issuer has to say, hey, is this fraudulent? Yes or no. Then they have to say, do you want it to be a chargeback? Meaning that they give the money back to the
mm,
consumer, but they also take it from the merchant. And we all know about
got it.
chargebacks.
So
right? So
if they check the box that says this is fraudulent, but they don't check the chargeback box, that's where we have that. Would you say it was a TC40?
yeah, correct. So I call it often like a fraud flag transaction,
Right.
but the report that Visa sends to the acquirer is called the TC40.
Hmm.
And that's what those of us, deep in this industry on the fraud side know about that. But really, most merchants, even like, and I've talked to ISOs every day, some of the biggest in the world, they
Right.
mostly don't even know.
Yeah. And so yeah, because like what would you do about that? Like as a merchant, how do you fight a TC40? You don't even know that it happened, right?
Exactly. And then that's part of the problem. So like those of us
Mm.
on this side of the industry, we're pushing back quite a bit actually on Visa and saying, hey guys, is this fair? Right? Merchants don't even know what this thing is. ISOs don't know what
Right.
this thing is. Acquirers know, but they normally don't do much with it. And so, but to
Right.
answer your question,
Hmm.
so it's difficult, right? So like, our platform, we actually ingest TC40 data every day in real time. So we can monitor it and show
Mm.
it to the merchant. So that helps. But then
Right.
as far as what can you do about it, right? So you cannot represent these, which is another reason why we feel it's unfair to the merchants. Uh, there's no recourse in that way. So what you have to do is prevent it in the first place. And really, there's a number of ways to do that. First, just like a chargeback, and for the most part, this is how I suggest for merchants to approach it. It's a chargeback. You might not have known about it in the past, but it's still a disputed transaction.
Mm.
Just you never got notified. So now we can notify you. So the way to fix it or prevent it is, why are you getting disputes? Why do you get a chargeback? Right. So that's the first step, right? Is pre-authorization. What are you doing wrong as a merchant? Right. It's not necessarily wrong, let's say,
Mm.
but what could you do better?
To
So
what could you do better to make the consumer more aware that they did in fact make this purchase?
correct. Yeah. And there's two, it's kind of twofold. One, how could the consumer be more aware? Two, is your marketing, I always tell merchants, go up to the beginning. How did the consumer find you? How did the purchaser find you? So is every step of the way in alignment with what you actually deliver? Right? If
Mm.
your marketing says something different than your sales page, says something different than your order page, says something different than what you actually provide, you're getting chargebacks
Mm.
and TC40s, right? So you want to
Interesting.
align all those things.
Mm.
Then kind of the next step is, okay, now think post off. Are you delivering? And ideally, are you over delivering?
Mm.
Is the communication good? Is the
Right.
branding all the same? Is the alignment good? Then the
Right.
next step is more where we come in at Fraud Deflect would be, you know, you can then sign up for our platform and you can use things like, like Order Insight, compelling evidence, alerts, and optimize this all, via our platform so that you can make sure this stuff all plays ball together. And again, it's all in alignment and get the best results so that you can say, like, using deflections, you don't do a refund, so and what like Order Insight and what our deflection service does is it lets us share information with issuer and with the consumer, right? We say you're telling multiple stories. It's all real time, it's all
Mm.
via data, and we pass up things like the shopping cart details, the branding. Let's say that maybe your DBA or your descriptor is your company name. Maybe the consumer doesn't know that, right? So we improve that by sending this information to the issuer. We also send them what was bought,
Mm.
right? Maybe James, you bought something, but your wife pays the credit card bill.
Right.
The URL is meaningless to your wife, but she knows you bought that fancy new microphone for your podcast,
Right.
right? So then she sees, oh wait, it's the whatever Elgato 3.0 microphone.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's James. He did this, so I don't want to refund that. He loves that microphone, and he got
Right.
it.
Right.
So why would I charge it back?
Mm.
Right? That's kind of where we focus up that side, trying to get it so that there's no refund
Right.
and there's no chargeback, and anything that stops at that point does not get on the TC40.
Mm. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a totally off the wall question. So this is just my own
Sure.
personal curiosity. So something I was dealing with recently. So help me understand the descriptor for a second. What are the actual rules? I was having an argument with somebody about this recently. So what are the actual rules around what my descriptor can be? I had a company that was like, no, the descriptor has to be the DBA name of the business. That is the only thing it can be. We won't allow it to be anything else, which was causing a really big problem. We were getting some, chargebacks on one of the ISVs that I own because it
Oh
was
yeah.
a bit of a mismatch because they had like, different locations and stuff. What are the actual rules around a descriptor and what Visa allows?
It's so I don't know that there's a really direct answer to that because I've heard different rules, but I think at one time, like in the old days, it had to be the DBA.
Okay.
But nowadays, I've got plenty of acquirers and ISOs I work with that as long as we can show that that is a branded thing we do, we own as the company that owns this merchant account,
Yeah.
then in most cases that we've dealt with, they'll allow it to be whatever we want. So
Mhm.
like for you, right? You might have a James's Enterprises LLC,
Right.
but you have five businesses. And I personally do this. Like I have an
Mhm.
LLC, meaningless name to the
Right.
world.
Right.
And whenever I start a new business, I do it under that LLC.
Right.
And so if I get a merchant account that says my LLC name, you won't know it and you're never going to because it
Right.
doesn't matter.
Right.
So, but what I want you to know is fraud deflect or whatever
Right.
the brand is I'm starting.
Right.
And so most of the time if you can justify it and show proof, you're
Right.
allowed to do that. And Visa's probably going to hear this. They can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure
Right.
that the
Okay.
rules, at least in practice,
Yeah.
allow you to put whatever you want
Well, because
within.
which makes sense to me because obviously that's in the best interest of the card brands because then the person's going to know what the thing is that they bought and they're going to recognize the
Exactly.
transaction, which is the core issue. So yeah, like
Yeah.
in our I'll give you the specifics actually. So in our specific case, this is a CC storage thing, right? So with CC storage, self-storage management software, right? You have these companies where they'll have like a single DBA name, but then they have multiple locations,
Yeah.
you
So it
know,
should be the descriptor ought to be the location with something related to the name.
right. And so we were looking to go even just like DBA name dash location name or vice versa. And
Yep.
we ran into some blockage because we were told the rules wouldn't allow us to do that. And I was like, I'm
I've
pretty sure that
had
that's not the case. But.
Yeah, I've had maybe, let's call it off the top of my head, 5% of the ISOs I've dealt with out there
Yeah.
will say that. But every other
Interesting.
one and the acquirers that I've always worked with,
Yeah.
they'll let you do whatever you
That's
want to do,
interesting.
but
Okay.
within reason, right? So
Right.
I like
Right.
what you said. What I always suggest to merchants is that you use some kind of unique identifier up front that maybe is your merchant account identifier. So, say it's merchant account one. So let's say it's MA1
Hmm.
hyphen. And then that next part should be consumer identifiable. The consumer that or the card holder should recognize that and that for sure, right?
Right.
I work, for example, I used to work with Epic Games, right? When they launched Fortnite.
Hmm.
And for, they've been around for 30 years. No one
Right.
knows that. But their descriptor was always Epic Games and makes perfect sense to the people that work there. But, I don't know if
Right.
you have kids, but
They won't
especially
know
when
what that
Fortnite
is.
was super popular,
Right.
they didn't come to the dinner table and say, "Hey, Dad, I'm playing. Guess what? Epic Games makes Fortnite, and I'm playing that today."
Right.
No, they said, "Dad, I'm playing Fortnite. I got this character, this skin, all these cool
Right.
things." Never mention Epic.
Right.
And
And
so when I got
then
to Fortnite, this is one of the first things I told the team there. I said, "Guys, I've never heard of Epic Games.
right.
I've heard Fortnite." So
Right.
that's your first change right there.
Yeah. And that
And that
probably that probably
killed
dropped
off
their
20-30% of their chargebacks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's so
Yeah.
interesting. Okay. All right. So let's go back here to VAMP for a minute. So I think we kind of have wrapped up the idea that VAMP is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think what you said was VAMP is basically Visa's attempt to take all of the kind of reporting elements of like monitoring chargebacks and TC40 and all that, putting that all together on one kind of unified platform to say, here's where you can see what percentage of your transactions are going chargeback or TC40. And they're also kind of making the rules there of like, hey, where that percentage could be, which you're saying right now, like looks like 2.2%, and then maybe going down to 1.5 at some point. Did I say that
Yeah.
right?
Sort of. So one correction, there's no way for you to see that via Visa, right? Visa doesn't deal with merchants. Visa deals with acquirers. So
Got it.
they
Okay.
are providing, I'm told, reporting for acquirers, but the
Got it.
merchants have to find it themselves. Some
Or
acquirers,
use a tool like Fraud Deflect to get that.
exactly,
Got
exactly.
it.
And I think if we're not the only, we're one of the only that actually has this built in from day one
Yeah.
into our, well, since VAMP was announced, into our
Right.
UI.
Got
And
it.
so we have a really cool report that shows you not only your MasterCard rates, they haven't
Hmm.
changed, so that works.
Right.
Your Discover, your Amex also shows you your VAMP rates and your old chargeback rate, plus
Right.
things like refund rates.
Okay.
And that's the other problem here too, is that, the situation is that, so like I said, there's merchant rules, there's acquirer rules.
Hmm.
So I did a video on this on LinkedIn. I recently had one of my ISOs send me an email from one of it's not our client, and they didn't give me anything I shouldn't have, but
Right.
they
Right.
sent me a blurt from an email from a high risk processor. It was alerting the merchant they were over the threshold for VAMP. It was not the merchant numbers. It was the acquire portfolio number. So, and I've been speculating this would happen. That acquirers just they
Mm,
not as in an insulting way. We all want to make money, but acquirers want to make money. And if they're held to a certain number, I figured there was going to be some interesting situations where
right.
the merchant number is so much higher. At 2.2, the start of fines for acquirers is 0.5, but it's for the whole
Mm,
portfolio. So
right.
you
And so
would
that's
think
on and that's on the acquirer to balance their portfolio and have enough low risk to offset the high risk. That's why they
exactly,
have the acquirer has an extra lever to pull. They have this variation where they can have their portfolio mix, whereas for a medium to high risk merchant, they don't have that lever to pull. They have to deal with the
exactly,
reality of their vertical.
exactly. So it's going to be pretty
Mm,
interesting. Like many of our merchants, even even using our system and having like 0.2, 0.3% chargeback rate
right.
overall, still with VAMP, before we make some other changes, they would still be over threshold in many cases. Now, most of them now aren't because we've made changes to fight back toward VAMP.
Right.
But so if you're out there thinking, hey, you
Mm,
know what? Who cares? I'm at zero point 0.7, so it's not zero point 0.9, so I'm good, and so it's not going to affect me. You got to check your VAMP rate. And if
mm,
your ISO acquirer can't help you with that, feel free to reach out to Fraud Deflect, but or some other provider. But
yeah.
you've got to check your VAMP rates
Mm.
as merchants.
One last question for you, real quick. So you talked about some of these operational changes earlier on in the process and how effective those can be, changing the descriptor, making sure there's a unified kind of marketing through the sales process, and then fulfillment. Um, is there anything else? Are there other things that you guys do? Are there other what else can be done to help me lower my chargeback rate?
Sure, sure. So
Or I
I
guess I should say my vamp rate now. So yeah.
yeah. Well, so two things. So one, here's what I'm telling merchants as far as what to monitor, right? So yes, absolutely your VAMP rate, but also break it out. What's your chargeback rate? What's your TC40 rate?
Okay.
But then also remember again, the acquirer is looking to make money. So risk is a big deal to them. And remember, the acquirer is on the hook if you go out of
Hmm.
business as a merchant.
Right.
So don't just look at those rates. Look at your old, I would still suggest merchants still stay under as a whole for a merchant account, under 1%, under 0.9, even
Mm-hmm.
though Visa says 2.2 for VAMP. I'd also watch your refund rate, right? I know some ISOs, some acquirers will shut you off at 10%.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't solely rely on alerts, for example, which we'll happily sell you alerts. We do great with those and do
Hmm.
a great job, but you got to balance all these things, right?
Yeah.
Now, now to answer your direct question, if you go, so we talked about making sure everything's in alignment, right?
Right.
Your marketing, your sales. We just talked about a descriptor. So what I
Hmm.
didn't say about a descriptor is the technical limit is 22 characters, but as many of you guys might know at least, this is an antiquated system, the banking systems, right? There's still a lot of mini computers and mainframes fixed with files. So you absolutely cannot go over 22 characters. You also really, I suggest not going over 15 because I've seen places, depending on the issuer it goes through, depending on the processors and the gateways, where that gets truncated. I've
Hmm.
seen issues where they combine the location or the phone number with your descriptor and they smush it all together. So
Right.
if you're at 22 characters, they're going to force that in there. So
Right.
keep it as small as you can, but make sure there's a prefix of some form in front so
Hmm.
that you can more effectively monitor and use different services like ours. It makes
Yeah.
it easier to monitor. Now, another thing you can do is that I look at VAMP as something that's kind of forcing us to go what you might call old school, right? The TC40 is harder to impact because there's no guarantees. Like RDR does not stop at TC40. That's what so many guys rely on now. RDR will stop the chargeback. So part of your new numerator, it does not stop at TC40.
Mm.
Now, Ethica and CDRN might stop TC40. Depends on the issuer. CE3 and Order Insight are what we call deflections. Those will stop at TC40. Right.
Mm.
So use those things, but you have to optimize. And then even before that, further upstream, the old school part, think about pre-auth anti-fraud. right? I don't think we need super strong pre-auth anti-fraud anymore because, the banks all do it. The acquirers do it. Visa, MasterCard does it. But I think merchants are going to have to start moving back to adding in some pre-auth anti-fraud, which actually we're starting to offer some of this kind of on a light side, like a device fingerprint, behavioral fingerprint, something to stop high velocity. Because that actually is another rule in VAMP that no one's really talking about, is what they're calling enumeration attacks. If you're over a certain percentage, and it's a pretty high percent, I don't remember, but they'll also ding you for that. So I'm just saying, hey, you should have that anyway. Don't let somebody buy your product 20 times in a minute. Why does that ever make sense?
Right. You need the technical limitations to stop that kind of thing.
Yeah. So think about some pre-auth anti-fraud. Like most of your gateways have some built in. If you turn it on, it'll cost you a little more, but it will lower your TC40. It'll lower your chargeback rate. But just be careful, because the stronger you put up front on pre-auth, the more false positives you have. And so it basically makes this whole world much more complicated, much more difficult, especially if you're new to it, or you're just, even if you've been doing it a while, but you weren't doing it 20 years ago.
Right.
It's changed so much since then. But I really feel like it's going backwards in that way, that we're going to have to put more focus on anti-fraud across the board, not just kind of the stopgap or Band-Aid that alerts used. And like
for sure. Scott, it's always a pleasure having you on here. I feel like every time we're on, I come up with like 5 different topics that we need to then dive into further. So we'll have to do this again. But for this episode, share with our audience if they want to learn more. Maybe they have a merchant that they want to get some help, or maybe they are a merchant looking to understand this better. Where would you send them to learn more?
Fraudtoflect.com.
Awesome. Scott, thanks again for your time and your insights. Really appreciate it, as always.
Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here again anytime.
Rich, it's great to have you back here on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Always enjoy this.
Yeah, me too. So we talked a couple of weeks ago about kind of the opportunity of the merchant services space. And then last week talked about kind of that first month and what it looks like to get started. But what's really going to happen as an agent gets out in the field is they're going to face rejection. They're going to face that feeling of failure of like, man, I'm not very good at this. So what I was hoping you could do for us today is maybe break down what are the most common objections they're going to hear from merchants, and maybe a quick idea of how we handle those. And then also just that common feeling of like, man, I'm not really good at this yet, because they're not, they just started, and how you deal with that. So talk to us about rejection and objections today.
Absolutely. Yes. I always say that the hardest door to overcome is this car door right here. Because when you really visualize representatives, and we've all done it. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of representatives. You're driving out in the area and they tell you to cold call, and you get out there. It's like you're looking at different businesses, and it's like, they look busy, or I don't know if I want to bother them, or I had a bad experience with that type of business. And all these things start racing through your mind with excuses. You develop excuse-itis. So the philosophy that you want to have is know exactly where you're going, get out there in the field, and go start contacting merchants. And you have to understand that you're going to get rejection. Sometimes people think, well, Rich Norton, you've written 600 in 1 year, or you write 300 plus every single year. When you walk into a business, it's just paved gold, and people are like, hey, Rich Norton is here. Where do I sign? Now, that may happen once in a while, but we get rejection. And I've taken people in the field with me, and I'm like, are you learning anything? They're like, yeah, I'm learning that I got to go to work. And they understand that you're going to get rejection. Go out there. So you can't let that affect you. However, you do want to be different from every other representative that goes out in the field, because most people go out there and they got their pitch and they walk in. It's like, hey, I'm from merchant services. Do you got a statement? I've talked to a lot of representatives that that's the way they're trained. It's like, walk in and get a statement and then tell them you're going to call them back. Well, immediately with that way of thinking, you've lost all your credibility, because you're basically saying, I have no idea what I'm doing. Just give me a statement. I'll send it to somebody else. We want the people to trust in us. I always say that the magic word when selling is you're helping people, but you're getting them to trust you. And that's a whole process. And I'm always amazed that we can go out in the field, meet someone for the very first time, and they say to you, James, I trust you enough that I'm giving you my whole life right now. I'm giving you my bank account, my social security. You know where I live, everything. You have access to everything. So that takes a lot to be able to build that trust. And how do you do that? You get people to like you. You be genuine. You be sincere. You be enthusiastic. you believe in what you're doing, but instead of having the mentality of I'm here in the convincing business, I'm here to help people. And then we're going to get objections like, we hear people like you all the time come by. That's probably one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, sure.
We just got a call. We got a representative here last week, and most representatives are going to say, "Well, I'm different from everybody else," and their response is going to be, "Well, that's what the last guy said."
Right.
So what
Right.
we want to do is show that we're different. When
Right.
somebody says, "Hey, we get reps like you all the time," say, agree with them. Say, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up because, man, I've been doing this a long time. These people have come out of the woodworks. Tell me if this sounds familiar. They call you up on the phone, they come in, and what do they want to do? They want to look at your statement, right? Why do they want to look at your statement? Because they want to see how much you're paying, and then knock off a couple pennies off, and that's it. Does that sound familiar? So I'm developing a nice rapport with them, handling that objection, and then rather than saying I'm different from everybody else, I use a third person approach. This is what merchants love about us. I've been helping a ton of merchants. What they love about us, they love the fact that they're dealing with a solid company, A+ rated company. They love the fact that they meet us in person, and they love the fact that we're completely different from everybody else. We're opposite from everybody else because we don't need to look at a statement. We know how much you're paying. As a matter of fact, we show people our statements, which is completely opposite. Can you see why merchants love dealing with a company like us? Coming back with another question. So whenever we get an objection, we always want to welcome the objection. Never get
Yeah.
defensive. Never get angry over it or even in your body language. Just welcome
Right.
that objection.
Right.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's what everybody tells me. This is what we've been able to do to help them, give a little testimony and then come back with another question, because the one that's asking the questions is the one that has the control of the scenario.
Yeah. Rich, one thing I was thinking when you were talking is I wonder, especially for the experienced agents, they listen to you all the time on here, and they're like, oh, yeah, Rich is the guy that does 300 to 600 deals a year. How many businesses on average would you say you walk into in a given day, and how many business owners do you talk to in a given day?
Yeah, great question. Be prepared to go out and talk to 25 businesses a day. This is the mindset that I teach everybody. Now, what's going to happen as you build momentum and as you build a pipeline, what you find, it's very rare that you have to talk to 25 businesses a day. There's days where I'll go out and talk to two and write them both up. There's days like yesterday that I looked in the mirror and I said, Rich, you suck at this today. What's wrong with you? And I got rejection. Everything wasn't going right. People are nasty couple people. I'm like, man, I feel like the new guy out here. I'm getting my what kicked. That happens. But here's what happens. Here's the exciting part about that is that if I do that, and I may only get one or very rare, maybe not get anything, I know if I keep doing that the next day with the same attitude, never letting that affect me, or the next door, I'm going to produce. And this is what everybody needs to understand. The system works. It definitely works. And we have to remind ourselves of that. Be prepared to go out and talk to 25 businesses a day. If you do that over a period of time, your life will be incredible. It'll be amazing. You'll have a great career.
Yeah, good stuff, Rich. Rich, tell us where we can go to learn more about your team and the training programs you have available.
Absolutely. Give me a call at 904-434-4635. Love to talk with you. You can email, if you prefer, payrock, Payroc, Rich Norton at gmail.com.
Thanks, Rich. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Next week, July 14th through 18th in legislative days, has been declared Crypto Week in Congress.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. The plan is for the House to vote on the Genius Act,
Okay.
which is legislation passed by the U.S. Senate to establish a regulatory framework for stablecoins, as well as a similar bill called the Clarity Act, which is a House bill that mirrors closely the Genius Act. President Trump has said he wants the House to pass the Genius Act as is. Not surprisingly, both bills have been hotly contested by Democrats. Also to be considered next week will be a bill called the Anti-CBDC Surveillance State Act, which aims to curb potential privacy concerns and surveillance risks associated with central bank digital currencies,
Hmm.
which are digital forms of a country's official currency. Now, CBDCs are not part of the U.S. payments structure right now, so it's a bit of a preemptive
Okay.
move. But still, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, we
And
all know how slow Congress is in
right,
getting
right.
things done, so it'll be interesting to see if
If
Crypto
they can do
Week
something. Yeah.
actually,
And so that last thing you said, the CBDC is that like an anonymity type thing? Is that what you're talking about? The anonymity?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly, so that people don't get for privacy concerns,
Got it. Got it.
and because the CBDC is a central bank digital currency.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so there's the prying eyes of the government, which people don't particularly care for.
Got it. Okay.
But like I said, we don't have CBDCs here in the U.S., and
Hmm.
President Trump has decreed he doesn't want them here in the U.S.
Hmm.
So it'll be interesting. I think, like I said, I think it's a preemptive move.
Okay.
Um, but it is interesting that they're going to take up the Genius Act and this thing called the Clarity Act because,
Right.
things are taking off with stablecoins, and we really do need
Yeah.
some kind of regulatory box to put them in,
Yeah, for sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
interesting. All right. Well, we'll see if the politicians can actually get something done next week or
actually get something
yeah.
done, right? Well, they
Yeah.
did get something done last week, so who knows? Maybe next
Yeah.
week they will. Who
Yeah.
knows?
All right.
Okay,
What's next?
so start speaking of stable coins, there have been a lot of numbers thrown around about the size of the stablecoin market. But what is it really? Zach Abrams, I reported last week, the co-founder of stablecoin platform Bridge, estimated the current market capitalization of stablecoins to be $400 billion. And he said that could grow to 2 trillion by 2028. As of, just to put that into perspective, the market cap of Visa and Mastercard card combined was 1.22 trillion
Wow.
as of July 1st, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah, July 1st. But the numbers crunchers and analysts at JP Morgan Chase think Abrams and others who have offered similarly optimistic projections are way off.
Yeah.
They say the current stablecoin market is about $15 billion and will reach only $500 billion by 2028.
Hmm.
And you know what? I kind of am trending towards that. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, Abrams has something to,
Hmm.
he has a vested interest in making sure this is big, right?
Right. Right. Or making
And
everybody feel like it will eventually be big so that they want to
yeah,
put more
it'll
in.
eventually be big, but I don't think, it'll take as long as it'll happen as quickly
Right.
as
Well, and I
everybody
think,
expects.
and yeah, and I think it's always, to me, whenever I hear these prognosticators with this type of thing, I feel like the thing that they always tend to forget is the change in consumer behavior. It's like
Exactly.
they're always like, well, as long as this great technology exists, everyone will obviously use it. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that.
Right.
People are not like, oh yeah, there's an advantage. I will immediately take advantage of it. No, there's going to be earlier adopters. They're going to try it out. Then you have your next layer. Then you have your next layer. Then you have the long tail, and people slowly, so it's, yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
look at mobile payments. I mean, that's a perfect example.
right, exactly.
I mean, mobile payments had the longest tail of any payment mechanism I could imagine. I mean, 10 years ago, 10 mobile payments were were a possibility. The
Right,
technology existed, but it's only been within the last year or two that they've really taken off.
right,
We
right,
can probably credit COVID with that, but I think it
right.
also is just consumer adoption takes
Yeah.
time.
Well, I mean, even credit cards, it's like
Right.
we're not at 90% card payments right now, even
No.
though there's been a significant advantage over cash for the last 40 years.
Right.
No, people are like, I still am going to use cash sometimes. And so,
I
you know,
right. I heard a statistic the other day that said credit, debit, and ACH combined only make up 79% of payments.
yeah,
And
right.
that's nowhere near ubiquity.
No, and it's been around for decades and decades. I mean,
almost 100 years. Well, no. The first credit card was like, the first like Visa card was like 1960. So what are we
right,
talking?
70 years almost,
70
65.
years. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a long time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and debit cards. I remember a friend of mine getting getting his credit card back in the early 80s, and they said, "Oh, you could use this for debit." And he, called me up and said, "What the heck is debit? What is this all about?"
Right, right,
I
right.
don't want
And
to do
and that's
this.
the thing is, 5 years from now, there's still going to be a lot of consumers that are going to be like, wait, what's a stable coin card? Why would I use that?
Right?
So
Exactly.
it's, there'll
Exactly.
be innovation. It'll happen quickly, but that doesn't mean there won't be a long tail. So,
Right. I agree. So
okay.
here's one that's a really interesting one. A U.S. District Court judge in Illinois has dismissed a lawsuit accusing MasterCard and Visa of conspiring with Apple to suppress network competition.
Hmm.
The judge ruled that the merchants hadn't provided enough evidence to support their claim that Apple illegally declined to launch a competing payment network to rival Visa and MasterCard. He said they only presented, quote, a slew of circumstantial evidence.
Hmm.
The lawsuit alleged Visa and MasterCard paid, quote, ongoing cash bribes that amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars a year to keep Apple from competing with them. Apple claimed it had never had any plans to enter the payments network market and compete with Visa and MasterCard.
Hmm.
And I gotta side with Visa, MasterCard, and Apple on this one. I mean, why would Apple want to? It makes all this money on its phones and on its apps. Why would it want to get into, you know, competing with entrenched payment networks?
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I think ultimately, I think the payments industry, as a general rule, we often see innovation. I think stablecoin's another example of this, where we see this innovation and we naturally think that this is going to blow up everything. But in
Right.
reality, it's so tantalizing to just say, "Hey, these rails already exist.
Mm-hmm.
Let's use that." And I think Apple did the same thing. And again, I think it's also a misunderstanding of how the payments industry works, where everybody thinks that Visa Mastercard are making all the interchange, and they're not.
Right.
So does Apple want to be their own bank? Yeah, they are actually in some ways. They are
In some
collecting
ways, they
interchange,
are. Right.
right? And
But
so
there's a
they're
difference
they're getting
between
a
being
big
a
chunk
bank
of
and a
it.
network.
Right. In other words, they don't want to, Apple doesn't want to create this network. They have to tie all of the stuff together to be able to accept the Apple Card, because why would they do that? They can pay such a small amount to Visa and MasterCard to do that, to be the rails. They want the interchange. They don't want the card brand fees. So,
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So,
yeah, very interesting.
it's interesting. I think, my feeling is that merchants just like throwing things at the court and see what they can get
Yeah, of
because,
course.
who
Because
knows?
this is
Maybe they'll
America.
find a friendly judge.
Yeah, right. Uh, Interesting. I think you have one more for us today, right, Patty?
Yeah, one more. And this is interesting. President Trump signed an executive order earlier this year, and I believe I reported on this, mandating that the US Treasury start phasing out checks beginning September 30th. That's
Mm,
not that far away.
right.
Now, Treasury put out a request for information on, okay, what should we do in lieu of checks?
Yeah, like how do we get rid of this? Yeah.
How do we do this? And they received hundreds of letters, and many of them were expected recommendations considering the authors. Notcha, for example, touted the benefits of using the ACH. The card brands pushed their networks and products. The clearinghouse put forth using RTP, the real-time payment
Hmm.
network.
Sure.
Several banking groups agreed RTP or FedNow, the Fed's real-time network, would be the way to go. And just as a haha, retailers used the common opportunity to push the Fed for adoption of new lower debit interchange rates, which
Mm,
was like,
right,
that
right,
doesn't have anything to do with this
right,
comment
right.
period. But
Sure.
that's how
Yeah.
retailers get. But the one that I found to be the most interesting, though, came from Early Warning Services. Now, you remember last week I explained to you Early Warning
Mhm.
Services is a fintech that's owned by many of the largest banks in the country.
Right.
And it also operates Zelle, which is the
Yeah.
peer to peer payment network that competes with Venmo.
Yep.
Um, Now, it touted Zelle as affording, quote, near instant delivery of funds and having, quote, lower fraud rates than checks, ACH, and card based payments. But here's the thing: three of the largest banks and owners of early warning services were sued last year by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for failing to adequately protect Zelle customers from financial fraud and scams.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I wonder though,
So,
if that would end up being a big consideration in this context, because, if we're talking about the Treasury, I doubt there's a tremendous risk of fraud in those payments anyway, right? I mean, isn't this going out to larger businesses and organizations and government entities,
yeah,
etc.?
but we have a whole lot of issues with Social Security checks being
That's
stolen.
true.
Don't you think the crooks are going to find a way to and
Sure. Yeah, good point.
insinuate themselves into this network?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Now
true.
that lawsuit
Yeah.
has since been dropped by the Trump administration, so it's no longer
Right. Hanging
pertinent,
over their heads, but yeah.
hanging over their heads. But you know, ranking Democrats on the House and Senate committees with oversight for banking, as well as the Senate subcommittee on investigations, is still kind of pushing this. They sent a letter to Zelle last week demanding to know what it's doing to track and stop social media scams that use the network to bilk Americans, because
Mm.
a lot of these scams are on social media
Yeah,
platforms.
sure.
And just to sort of put that in perspective, J.P. Morgan has already begun to block Zelle payments that originate from social media sites.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, I, I put in my crook mind, my crook
Yeah,
hat
yeah.
for a second. Not that I'm a crook, but I'll,
Right.
think like that. And I've been writing about this stuff long enough to know how they think. And, I could see them, you know, sending a, a, a tweet of some sort, or just sending a Facebook notice, for example,
Sure.
right, to grandma saying, hey, your social security is at risk. We need to have your number so that we can,
Right, sure.
fix this problem,
Hmm.
and then have all the money come to them. I mean,
Yeah.
that happens already.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it'll be interesting.
It almost seems like what could be really interesting though would be if they use like the Zelle, Rails, but they made their own kind of branded version of it for the Treasury. Something like that where,
That's an excellent idea. Yeah.
or then it could
That
be,
could,
yeah, then it wouldn't be about, hey, Zelle. It's like, no, like this is the Treasury distribution network or whatever. And it's like, some they
right.
could almost white label the tech from somebody else, but build out like a robust, you know, payment
True.
network almost on top of somebody. I think it did with Visa and MasterCard as well, but building that on somebody else's rails to where it would
Or
be
Fed
very
now.
clear.
I mean,
Yeah, right.
Fed now to
Sure.
me would be the most obvious, the most
Yeah, sure.
logical way to do that,
Right. Yeah.
because it would have all the guardrails necessary. It's
Yeah.
government to government, cooperation.
Yeah. Good
So,
point. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, good
Well,
stuff,
that's
Patty.
it for this week.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much
Thanks.
for all the time you put into researching this stuff, and we're ready to hear again next week.
I appreciate it, man.